everybody. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the women's rights movement and the temperance movement. These were two huge movements for women in the 19th and early 20th centuries, okay? So first, I'm going to focus on how the women's rights movement really grew out of the abolition movement, interestingly enough. So kind of two of the key figures here are Sarah and Angelina Grimke. I have their picture up on the screen so you can see what they look like. They were from the South. They were born and raised in South Carolina, and their father owned just a massive plantation. He owned hundreds of slaves, okay? So they saw firsthand the evils of slavery. Even from a pretty young age, you could tell they weren't totally on board with this. Sarah, for example, taught her personal slave to read, which was illegal at the time. But anyway, they ended up kind of completely rejecting this lifestyle. They moved up north, they became Quakers, and they decided to go on tour to talk about the evils of slavery. Okay. So on Moodle, I've hosted Angelina's Appeal to Christian Women of the South. It is an optional read. And it partly because it's really dense. I do encourage you to at least skim over it, though. Remember, like, this is a white woman raised on a massive plantation making an appeal to other Christian white women specifically that slavery is wrong. All right, so that is her audience. That is her goal in this. Okay, It wasn't very well received, all right? I'll be really honest with you. They did not appreciate what she had to say, okay? But soon their abolition work took on a new focus, and that was women's rights. So how did this happen? All right. First, when they went on these abolitionist tours to talk about the evils of slavery, they addressed only women, which was considered like kind of proper for the time, okay? But then men started going to their meetings, all right? This caused significant problems. Some Congregationalist ministers in Massachusetts issued a pastoral letter in 1837 discussing how decisive both abolition was and also denouncing the Grimke sisters in particular for their actions of getting involved in this controversy, but also that they were women doing this, okay? So Sarah Grimke writes the Letters on the Equality of the Sexes, which is a women's right classic. She uses scripture to argue for equality, okay? This is also up on Moodle. It's an optional reading as well. This one is very lengthy, okay? It's more like a book. But anyway, I put it up there if you ever want to look at it, okay? So this is kind of one of those turning points in sort of the struggle for women's rights, all right? Another major moment is the establishment of like the formal women's rights movement at Seneca Falls in 1848. So there's this big international anti-slavery convention being held in London in 1840, all right? Unbeknownst to the American delegates, women were not allowed to speak at this conference. So this was a big issue because a number of the American delegates were women. Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker, was a delegate, and she was told she couldn't speak. Another woman was there, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she was actually the wife of a delegate, but she was equally upset about this, okay? So this is kind of one of those chance meetings in history, all right? Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They're upset about what's happening at this convention, so they discussed some ways that they could tackle this issue. What could they do about this, all right? So it took a while, but eventually the two of them host the first women's rights convention in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. It was near her house. It was in a church, actually. And at this convention, which a number of people attended, both men and women, they wrote and signed a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, all right? It was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, two other women named Amy Post and Catherine Stebbins, and then actually, interestingly enough, Frederick Douglass was one of the folks who wrote this. So up on the screen, I actually have kind of a old newspaper clipping of kind of the intro line, all right? And you can see on here, it really plays off of the Declaration of Independence, but obviously it's focused on kind of gender equality, okay? Now, this movement is very much focused on suffrage in particular, though it touches on just other like legal laws, legal inequalities that women faced at the time. The movement starts in the United States, but of course it expands very, very quickly. Okay. I put another link on Moodle to an article about global women's suffrage. Again, it's optional reading, but I think you'll find it really interesting. You can see kind of which countries granted voting rights when. I think you'll be really surprised at some countries that didn't grant voting rights for a very, very long time. Okay. So, you have this kind of big moment, this movement where women start coming together to demand the right to vote. All right. I do want to take a moment to discuss kind of the relationship between women's rights and religion, because it can sometimes be contentious. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, I've got her picture up here now. She ended up completely rejecting Christianity as inherently opposed to women's rights. Okay, she personally ended up getting involved in the Theosophy movement, but she and another kind of colleague of her in the fight for suffrage named Matilda Jocelyn Gage were very outspoken in their rejection of Christianity, enough so that their own women's rights movement, the NWSA, actually passed a resolution distancing themselves from some of the work that they had done, like the Women's Bible, which is genuinely an interesting piece of history. The Women's Bible is basically a Bible commentary that focuses on passages that have to do with women or the subjugation of women in the Bible. It's not particularly flattering to the faith, and there was a really, really strong reaction against it. However, interestingly, in the 1970s, kind of second wave feminist historians and theologians kind of rediscovered this, and it's kind of gotten a second heyday. Anyway, but the point is there were plenty of women in the women's rights movement that were Christians that felt it was compatible with their faith, but not all did, even back in the 19th century. Okay, so. All right, let's move on a little bit and talk about temperance. All right, there is a fair amount of overlap between temperance and women's rights. Okay, and it is actually a little difficult to articulate how popular this movement was at the time. Okay, we are sitting on the other side of prohibition, which failed like horribly. All right, the temperance movement, though. It was global, though admittedly Americans were probably the most passionate about this. In some other contexts, the temperance organizations may be tackling other issues than alcohol. For example, in the chapter you read by Li Ma, she mentions the Chinese WCTU, which also dealt with like opium, which was more of an issue in China. Okay. If you don't know kind of the history about how Westerners imported opium to make money and all, it's kind of terrible / interesting. So that was an issue that the Chinese WCTU was tackling. But the overarching theme of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, of course, was alcohol. Okay. First, let's talk a little bit about this 19th century context. To be fair, people drank a lot in the 19th century, okay? There are estimates that Americans drank on average 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year in America, all right? This was taking a big toll on people's health, all right? Women did not have legal protections at the time. If somebody's husband abused alcohol or was physically violent, she really had no legal protections, okay? So you can see how alcohol became a very, very big issue for women, okay? Frustrations really, really boil over in the 1870s with the militants of the Women's Crusade in the United States. This particular movement began when a group of women, kind of inspired by a local temperance preacher met at a Presbyterian church in Ohio to pray and organize around the issue of alcohol. Then this group moves out and they decide to go to saloons where they start praying and singing hymns with the goal of trying to get the saloon owner to stop selling liquor. Okay, their actions spread. By the summer of 1874, over 900 cities in the U.S. had experienced this same phenomenon. Okay, occasionally these hymn singings and praying sessions would devolve into actual property destruction. Women were distressed, angry, and frustrated by the effects of alcohol. Many had lost husbands, sons, brothers to alcohol, and these crusaders were really religiously inspired. Okay, sometimes preachers and ministers supported these crusaders, especially if they were supporters of temperance themselves. Otherwise, they criticized women for their unwomanly behavior going into these saloons, which were really spaces for men at this time. Okay. So I have a woman up on the screen here. Her activities are a little later than this initial women's crusade, but she really represents this frustration that many women felt. So this is Carrie A. Nation here. Nation physically destroyed saloons, often with her trusty axe. As you can see in the picture, she is carrying her axe, kind of looks a little bit more like a hatchet. But anyway, she was able to finance these campaigns by selling little hatchet pins. She was a bit of a self-promoter, okay? And her determination to take down alcohol kind of stems from both a deep piety and some rather traumatic life experiences involving alcohol and alcoholism within her family. Nation is kind of unusually aggressive, as were some of these crusaders in the 1870s. But it shows how kind of angry and desperate some people were feeling about this issue. Okay. Now, kind of as fun as Carrie A. Nation is, the WCTU here, now that I have the picture up, was actually a lot more effective at bringing change than just going and destroying saloons randomly. So when the WCTU first formed, the organization was really focused on temperance alone, okay? But this changes when Frances Willard is elected president. I put up another video on the WCTU. It is part of the Ken Burns documentary on Prohibition. It's I think it's like a 7-minute clip, and it's pretty interesting. I would encourage you to watch that. So under Willard's leadership, the WCTU really expands its focus politically. Willard and her supporters were without question more progressive than most of the rank and file members of the WCTU. And during this point in history, women's suffrage was kind of radical, all right? A lot of people, including women, did not support this, okay? However, Willard comes up with a really brilliant solution, and that's called home protection, okay? It is unlikely, in my opinion, that Willard actually bought into ideas of kind of womanhood and women's fears, okay? She never married, she maintained a successful career, and she lived with a female companion named Anna Gordon, okay? However, what she does is she comes up with this idea of home protection, this campaign, and through this, she argues that by obtaining the vote and by outlawing alcohol, women were merely holding true to their womanly nature and acting within their domestic sphere. Okay, so women were not demanding suffrage because it was a universal right based on equality. They were demanding suffrage because it was the means through which women could protect their home from the evils of King Alcohol. Okay, do you get that logic? So while some of the more radical suffrage supporters like Jocelyn Gage viewed Willard and her politics as very dangerous, Willard's tactics were actually wildly successful. It was Willard, not folks like Gage or Susan B. Anthony, who actually encouraged widespread support for universal suffrage amongst more moderate and conservative women at the time. Okay. Now, I have to mention that the WCTU is not without controversy, okay? First, their main platform essentially failed, okay? Prohibition failed, and so that is genuinely an issue. Secondly, the organization tended to be Protestant, white, and middle to upper class, okay? Yes, there were women of color involved, like Amanda Berry Smith, but that was kind of unusual, all right? Kind of the core of their membership was very like white Protestant middle class, okay? And then there was a number of people then and now who accuse them of kind of forcing their own cultural beliefs onto other people. They would use these tactics that are a little bit manipulative. You'll see what I mean when you watch that short video on the WCTU, okay? These are accurate criticisms, I would say, though they did accomplish some really good things. I think one of the prime things that they accomplished that I think is excellent is they got the legal age of consent in the United States raised from as low as 7 in some states all the way to 18. And of course, pushing women's rights and women's suffrage to be more mainstream in American politics was obviously kind of a positive thing too. All right, so I could go on and on about different kind of things related to these topics, but I'm going to wrap it up for now. I'll talk a little bit more about some different reform issues in week 5 in regards to the 20th century. But for now, I'm going to leave it as it is. All right. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, don't hesitate to reach out to me. All right, everybody. Thanks. Have a great day.